For those of you who were not here on the first panel, my name is Christopher Sands, and I am a professor and director of the Center for Canadian Studies here at Johns Hopkins University's NITS School of Advanced International Studies, SICE as we call it. And it is a pleasure again to welcome you to this panel, which differs from our previous panel in that this is where we really will focus on the Canadian election and Canada's preparations to address something that's a hot topic here in Washington, fake news. Someone around here keeps tweeting about it. Everyone keeps accusing each other of it. But Canada's trying to address this vulnerability that all of our democracies around the world face, which is unfair voter influence and mis- and disinformation. Happily, you will not have me moderating this panel, but we will have Louisa Savage. Louisa Savage is a long-time award-winning journalist who has covered Washington for Canadian periodicals and is now an executive director at Politico. One of her passion projects is Politico Pro Canada, where she has brought a level of political coverage that we've become accustomed to. The standards are rising very much here in Washington to the Canadian scene, but it's part of Politico's very global approach that tries to get out of the sort of U.S. hidebound, navel-gazing world to really internationalize production. She's moderating a panel that includes one of her colleagues from the vast Politico empire, Mike Farrell. Mike's a cybersecurity reporter who has a tech beat, has covered these issues at a high level of technical skill, but also with policy acuity. He's got a good sense of where the vulnerabilities are, and if you enjoyed some of what we talked about in the last panel, I think you'll find this one particularly useful, and Mike's great to have on the panel. And then we have Rick Roth, who is with Global Public Affairs. He is a recovering political staffer, possibly a once and future political staffer, who worked with John Baird, Canada's foreign minister, in helping to address some of the challenges of foreign influence on elections during the Harper government. He's been involved with Ontario politics as well. We've seen a lot in recent years coming from both Ottawa and Queen's Park, and he has his finger on the pulse of that. Bringing also another aspect to this, which I think is useful, which is how does it look from inside the party structure? How do politicians view these kinds of interventions? And then last but not least, I'll be on the panel, but you've heard enough from me. Let me turn it over to Louisa.
Well, thank you so much, and thank you for joining us, and thank you to all those joining on the live stream. As Chris mentioned, I'm Louisa Savage, and one of the things I do is oversee and build Politico Pro Canada, which is a subscription service focused on the Canada-U.S. relationship and starting this fall on Canadian domestic policy as well. It's one of 16 policy verticals that we have at Politico, including newly launched Politico Pro Cannabis that launched this month. And I'm going to give Mike a promotion here. He's actually the editor of Politico Pro Cybersecurity, and so he runs a team of reporters dedicated to covering cybersecurity at Politico. So we're thrilled to be a part of this conversation as we're trying to really elevate the conversation around binational issues between the United States and Canada, both for our subscribers in Canada and here in the U.S. and abroad. This obviously election security, foreign meddling, huge issue in pretty much every democracy around the world. So it behooves us all to understand what we're all doing, how it compares, and what lessons we can learn from each other. We obviously have a Canadian election coming up October 21st, and then we have a U.S. election next November. So these two conversations happening simultaneously in both countries, and I think it's great of Chris to bring us together and see where those conversations intersect and where they don't. So I'm going to cast Chris today in the role of Canada expert and have him fill us in on the details of new Canadian policies that have been brought in. But before we do that, I wanted to kick off with Mike, because I wanted him just to set the table for us very briefly as to what we learned about election interference and election meddling in 2016, and then what has the United States government done in response. And I think from there, we can then talk about what the Canadian government is doing and how it is or is not different. So, Mike, why don't you just walk us through, there's a lot of noise around what happened in 26, but just walk us through incisively exactly what happened and what the policy response has been in Washington.
Sure. Thanks so much, Louisa. And thanks for that promotion.
You're welcome.
I expect many more after this. So thanks to you guys for sticking around as well. I think like as Louisa mentioned, it was 2016 and the U.S. election that we really saw the scope of Russian interference and the massive concerted efforts to really influence an election. And we're 3 years later, we're still really trying to figure out all the parts and pieces of that campaign. I mean, tomorrow the Federal Election Commission is holding a disinformation day-long discussion, and they've ordered tech companies to come. So they're still trying to wrap their heads around what happened. But I mean, a lot of things have happened as a result, and a lot of change has taken place. It's sometimes difficult to recognize the change because this issue has also become highly politicized. Trump tweets daily about the fake news media, that the witch hunt that the Mueller investigation was. But if you do put some of that aside, somewhat ironically, his administration is taking a lot of very proactive steps to work against Russian disinformation, election meddling in other ways, such as vulnerabilities in election systems. So, I mean, if you think back to the initial intelligence report that came out, sort of outlining and really detailing what the scope of the Russian campaign was, you have seen, concrete government actions as a result of that, right? There were charges against GRU officers and the Internet Research Agency, which is the troll farm that carried out and organized and created a lot of the campaigns that were spread throughout Facebook and Instagram, YouTube videos and such. There have been sanctions against Russians. There have been everything. In fact, there was, the thought was, as we were learning all of this, like the big concern was, well, what was going to happen with the midterms? So there was a great deal of attention focused by Department of Homeland Security, U.S. Cyber Command, to try to thwart any attempts to disrupt the midterms. And afterwards, we did see actions by the Russian agents to spread, disinformation via social media around the midterms. So, I mean, I think that, not to say we've got this problem figured out. I think we're a long ways from doing that. There hasn't been this whole of government strategy. There's been legislation such as the Honest Ads Act that have been proposed but have kind of been stuck in committee. I think because on one hand, there's a lot of concern within agencies and policymakers about this issue. Because it's been so politicized, you see a lack of action from a legislative point of view.
So if you look across all the discussion since 2016, can you point to any specific steps that are going to be different in the next election? Anything different from what we had in 2016? I understand we went back and prosecuted people who were involved in 2016, named them, et cetera. But what are any defensive steps that are being taken ahead of 2020?
Sure. I mean, I think that the fact that we're looking for it is a big change to begin with. And the social media companies, again, they are on one hand saying they are doing more, and on the other hand, sort of pushing against regulation. They are taking steps to sort of rid their systems of troll accounts that, and that we know had been established long before the 2016 elections in anticipation of being able to carry out operations, spread false narratives, sort of create chaos and discord among minority groups. If you look at what happened with offensive operations from the military point of view, the Cyber Command actually took action around the midterms to shut internet access off to the IRA. So I'd very much expect something like that happening ahead of 2020. I mean, you have you also had kind of these task force that involved members of the FBI, DHS, the social media companies, the other members of the intelligence community, sort of as manning the phones, if you will, on election night to sort of see what sort of problems there were. So those things will exist around 2020 as well.
Where would you say within the U.S. government apparatus, where is the leadership? Is there someone who is really leading the charge here? Is it coming out of Cyber Command? Is it coming out of DHS, the Pentagon? How does that look?
Well, you do have a relatively new cybersecurity agency within DHS that is taking somewhat of the lead and reaching out, especially with industry. Last week, I think it was, you had a contingent of government government officials meeting in Silicon Valley with Google, Facebook, and others to sort of, continue pressing the platforms to do more. But you're also getting a lot of pushback on the government. Like if the companies are saying, well, if you want us to do more, we need to know more of what you know, because oftentimes the platforms are often in the dark about who are the operators, who are the fake operators, taking advantage of their systems, which are designed to be open and frictionless and create opportunities to spread information and share things. So there's, I would say the leadership is coming from DHS. In the domestic front, it's coming from Cyber Command and NSA on the international front.
Okay. Before we move to Chris to explain the Canadian policy, I wanted to ask Rick just to jump in and help us just set the scene, particularly for those in the audience who maybe aren't from Canada. You were a senior aide in a previous life to Canada's Foreign Minister, John Baird, under a previous government. Who wants to meddle in the Canadian elections and why? Just very briefly, just set the scene before we go to the remedy.
Yeah, great question. I mean, Canada doesn't have a lot of international foes, so to speak. There's obviously some trade tensions with China that the Americans are involved with. So obviously, I think the Chinese probably have some skin in the game. Canada's been a pretty vocal critic of Russian intervention in Ukraine. But it's pretty bipartisan, and shouldn't necessarily they wouldn't have as much skin in the game as they did probably in the presidential election.
Mm-hmm. So there's not a sense that Russia has a preferred outcome in the Canadian election.
No, actually, so
necessarily.
the leader of the Conservative Party is actually banned from entering Russia, as well as I guess the foreign minister as well from the Liberal Party. So it's pretty across the board disdain from Russia to Canadian politicians.
So what is the real fear here that requires a policy response?
Yeah, I think I think a lot of people were caught off guard with what happened in the United States, and I think Canada just saw this as an opportunity to kind of get ahead of any sort of intervention. I don't think that there's necessarily a real threat, but to say that there's no threat is probably underestimating it.
Mm-hmm. And I guess another issue that would be at stake more broadly is just the reputation and success of democracy.
Yeah,
writ
absolutely.
large, right?
And
if
look,
you can mess with democracy in any country,
Yeah.
it makes them all look bad.
And I mean, at the end of the day, democratic countries for a long time have been, they wouldn't call them disinformation campaigns. We would have called them information campaigns. But using technology to penetrate firewalls in Iran. The State Department ran a similar campaign to the government of Canada that I was a part of at the time, and it was to kind of talk to Iranian citizens, what their issues were, what they wanted to see from their new president, and this was after Ahmadinejad left government. So same sort of campaigns were run in Ukraine. We supported kind of pro-democracy movements where they would drop leaflets from airplanes into kind of remote areas, again to kind of provide information. So to say we call Russian disinformation, and when it's democratic, it's kind of information.
Well, maybe when it's just fact-based.
Yeah, no,
information.
absolutely.
I would draw that distinction, maybe.
Yeah, absolutely. So I think that there's competing sides, and there was I heard a story one time during the transition from Bush to Obama. State Department officials or national security advisors were kind of advising what they were doing around the world, and Obama's quick quip back was, we need to be careful that this they could turn this technology around on us, and they did, and it seemed somewhat prescient in his views.
Okay. Well, great. So, Chris, we wrote about Canada's new policies at Politico, and our Canada reporter, our amazing Canada reporter, Alex Panetta, and our tech reporter in Brussels wrote about this policy together, and they wrote, and I quote, "Canada spent the last 3 years developing the most detailed plan anywhere in the Western world to combat foreign meddling in its upcoming election. But with the country's national campaign to begin in a matter of weeks, one question remains: will the efforts pay off?" So I'm hoping we can shed a little light on that. So can you walk us through what the Canadian government has announced with regard to its policy on election meddling?
Sure, and to pick up on something that Rick mentioned, it's important to contextualize this beginning with 2015, because in the Canadian election in 2015, there was a lot of discussion about democratic reform. And this was an issue that Justin Trudeau and the Liberals used to try to argue that they were more in favor of inclusion, that they wanted to be interested in things like proportional representation, new voices in politics, and transparency, all sort of issues tied up in this question of election reform. And after the election, Justin Trudeau, as Prime Minister, appointed a Minister for Democratic Institutions to try to look at reform. And that's the trajectory we're at in 2015 going into 2016. The U.S. election, very much as Mike said, it really threw that off, because it suddenly got a lot of Canadians worried about the security and integrity of elections before they were worried about experimenting with proportional representation and other methods. The government itself responded by asking the Communications Security Establishment, which is Canada's equivalent of the National Security Agency, to do a review of what the threats to Canada might be. And I don't know, Rick, if you have a sideline working for them, but it was very similar to what you said, which is there's no specific evidence. They offered nothing that said Canada had been a target or was a target, but they talked about the experiences of other major democracies and said we'd be foolish not to be prepared. You said it better, but that was essentially the argument. And they in particular focused on two case studies. That was the U.S. election in 2016, which they argued, I thought very deftly in that report, that it wasn't so much the outcome. They weren't questioning whether Trump was elected or any of those questions, but the loss of legitimacy and the loss of confidence in the system as being something that would be that Canada was vulnerable to as well. The other example they looked at was the Brexit referendum and Britain's experience, where the British intelligence was worried that there had been some interference and some misinformation, disinformation. Largely, they focused on Russia in that campaign. And of course, it was a very close. I think for Canadians who've had a couple referenda on Quebec's role in the country, they know how close referenda can be. And the idea of just, even if you're moving fractions of percentage points, this really focused Canada's minds on the importance of keeping the system well protected. That led to a rapid debate about what could be done. I'm going to fast forward only to say that most of what happened in Canada literally happened in 2018. There was some initial activity in the spring, in April and May. There was in May of 2016, there was a bill introduced, the Elections Modernization Act. It ultimately gets passed at the end of the year, in December of 2018, and that was almost the last minute that you would need to have this in place in order to have agencies make changes so that it could be implemented in the 2019 election coming up in a few weeks. And that's important too. This was a hurry-up effort on an issue where people hadn't quite defined the threats, and so they really stayed almost, as we talked about in the previous panel, at the level of digital charter. There are some things here which are clearly promissory notes, works in progress, plans of things to come. So a couple of big pieces from the Election Modernization Act. The new act requires that platforms keep advertising records. And this is similar to something we've seen DHS do with regard to people movement, something that you can go back forensically and figure out, well, these were all the ads. The concern here was micro-targeting, that maybe overall political parties or some group might have an ad campaign that looks good to the public, but they're micro-targeting perhaps to push messages that are more negative, like hateful messages or base motivating messages. It could be disinformation. So they want the platforms to keep those records so that they're auditable afterwards. Also, the platforms are prohibited by law from selling political advertising to any non-Canadian entity. This was meant to prevent Russian bots or any from outside the country from being able to buy ads on Facebook or intervene. Some question as to how well the platforms are going to be able to implement that, and whether they will actually know who they're selling to. But at least that's the intent. Also, in order to protect the voter records and make sure there was something against which they could check, Bill C-76, the Election Modernization Act, also creates a pre-registry of voters. So you vote in Canada at 18, like you would in the United States, but there's a registry being set up for 14 to 17-year-olds that establish some of their information prior to their being able to vote, so that they are in the system. So that way it will be easier to pick up fraud, which often occurs at the beginning of the electoral rolls where they're new voters anyway, and so perhaps that's where you could have some gap. They've also reintroduced something which is interesting in an American context: voter ID cards with barcodes, both to streamline getting people ready to make their vote, but also because they wanted to have a more solid form of ID for Canadians, so that it was harder to hack, not just an electronic voter roll that could be intervened with, but something with a hard card.
I'm sorry to interrupt, but we should probably establish this is all being done at the federal level.
Right.
Because it's a federal.
You're quite right. So for a long time, there is this entity, Elections Canada, that is federal. For a long time, the provinces had their own voter rolls, and there were, this was a local election administration really mattered. But now, Canada's Election Canada unit now covers the whole country. There's a single voter roll, and so many of these things are national now. It's a huge difference from the way the U.S., which has a very decentralized voter election administration structure, similar to what Canada used to have, although even more at the county level sometimes. Canada's been able to do this all very naturally and nationally. And there's one other thing I would just mention, because I think it's an important development. There's long been a system in Canada of vouching, where you could go and say, look, this guy's my neighbor, or look, I know this lady, she lives on my block, and they take a record of that, and they'll allow you to vote, even if you didn't have ID or you just moved in. That personal vouching has been reintroduced into the system as a sort of no-tech, not even low-tech, way of making sure that people aren't denied the right to vote on the day they show up because of a screw-up in records. Some of the criticism, and we, those of you who follow this, we advertised we'd get Ed Greenspan here, and we're a good friend of all of ours from the Public Policy Forum in Canada, and they've kind of identified one of the big problems here, which is there are 3 levels at which the Election Modernization Act might have been hoped to address challenges. Political parties, because they're big actors, they collect a lot of data, they crunch a lot of numbers. What are people's privacy rights to that data, and how might it be manipulated? Secondly, the election administration piece, and thirdly, voters themselves. And the criticism that Ed's group has come up with, he wrote a big paper with Taylor Owen from the University of British Columbia, and their criticism was that the focus has been too much on election administration, that there's a little bit on voters, and there's almost nothing to control political parties, which they see as the weakness of the approach. They've also said, the emphasis of the Election Modernization Act is very much on the demand side, the voters, the participants in the system, but not so much on the supply side. These are the people who are actually putting the disinformation into the system. They want more regulation of political speech. Now, that's something that would be very different in the U.S. People would object to it, but it sort of gives you a sense of where people are feeling the shortcomings of this legislation have been.
I was hoping you could also speak to one other aspect of Canada's response, which is something called the Critical Election Incidents Public Protocol. I don't even think there's like a good acronym for that. But this is the notion that there will be I understand, a 5-person team of nonpartisan public servants led by the clerk of the Privy Council, which for Americans, it's the best analog I can think of would be like a White House chief of staff figure sort of running the policy arm of the government. And also the national security advisor to the prime minister. They're running this 5-person group, and they're supposed to use the intelligence services and alert the public when there's a threat. How is that going to work? This is something that presumably intelligence services could do. We know that the FBI director, James Comey, here wanted to alert the public about Russian interference, and then the President Obama, said no at the time. A lot of fears of politicizing things. How can that actually work in practice?
Well, I think you're right to raise it. So the critical election incident public protocol is very much in the promissory note aspect, I think, of Canada's approach. They needed something in place now for the election coming up. They went to the non-political, professional part of the civil service to get people who would hopefully retain public confidence and are not tied to a political party. Those of you who are familiar with the British system know that there are certain things that civil servants can do while the government's in a writ period. They're not supposed to make any major decisions, but they are supposed to keep the lights on and do certain basic things. So it's very much in that parliamentary government context. So you have the Clerk of the Privy Council, you have the National Security Advisor and Intelligence Advisor to the Prime Minister. You have the Deputy Minister of Justice, also the Deputy Attorney General, usually the same person, the Deputy Minister of Public Safety, the equivalent of DHS in Canada, and then the Deputy Minister of Foreign Affairs. And their mandate is sort of, to borrow from DHS, if you see something, say something. That they're supposed to raise a flag if they see something that's clearly false or if they become aware of a hacking operation. That design, and I thought it was interesting you brought up James Comey, was really designed to make sure there wasn't a James Comey moment where an individual is grappling with what do I do because I think there's a problem. Now the clear guidance is you take it to this group. If this group agrees, they will raise it in public, and that's the expectation, not that it will be shunted off to the side. But it still has some of the Comey dilemma. Because what if you have something you don't think it's good, but you're not 100% sure, and the vote is coming up in a few days? It puts tremendous pressure on these individuals to make a call. Insofar as they don't make a call and everybody thinks the election's fine, the credibility, the performance legitimacy of this mechanism will go. But to the extent that this is tested by a shock, I think right now it's a very thin layer of protection. It's the kind of thing that could easily make a bad call and therefore delegitimize this approach and send Canada back to the drawing board because it doesn't really have a lot of worked out principles. I'll give you another example, not to pick on the Harper government. Canada worried a little bit during the Harper government about having a national security review of foreign direct investment and set up a mechanism to do those reviews in response to some big foreign investments in Canada, including by the Chinese, Nexen, the oil company. But it was a fairly opaque process that seemed to have a sort of political fudge factor in it. And so it didn't necessarily build up confidence among foreign investors and others that, yes, this is a system that is as good as, for example, the CFIUS system, the Committee on Foreign Investment in the United States, which is operated here by Treasury. Now, that's partly because the CFIUS system has a longer track record and more people know about it. Here, I think that the vehicle looks impressive and it needs some road testing miles on it before people will have confidence in it, but they're clearly reacting to what's been happening all over the world, and particularly what's been happening here.
And some of the things that the principles around this are quite broad. It says some of the facts as laid before them. Will this undermine the credibility of the Canadian election? Asking civil servants to come to a position, 5 civil servants to come to a position that if this is going to undermine a Canadian election, I find it could be difficult for them to come to any sort of consensus. And I also have to say, any sort of national security advisor, even civil servants and deputy ministers are very cautious about communicating, and would you're basically asking them to intervene during an election period, to raise red flags, but not necessarily to have any kind of fixes. Any sort of national security advisor would also probably want to, if they have information or if they've been tipped off, wouldn't necessarily want to raise the red flags because think of, they could probably get more information kind of the longer they wait. So there's a ton of factors, as Chris said, that I think, need some road testing before it's figured out.
Okay,
Yeah,
well,
and
go ahead,
I was
Mike.
going to say, I think one of the issues you're touching on is like when to communicate that there's evidence of a disinformation campaign or a hacking campaign is certainly something that is everyone in the U.S. who deals with this is thinking about as well. I mean, I think even though they're around the midterms, right, there are these war rooms focusing and looking at disinformation campaigns or any anomalies they were seeing on social media. I think they were very quiet and very careful about what they said during the election period because I mean, the one thing that we know that the people carrying out these operations want to do, it's not necessarily that they just want to support one candidate, right? They want to, discredit the entire process, right? So if there's one way that you could feed into what they're trying to do by, talking about it, or like, so, if you say, well, there's, a disinformation campaign that the Russians are carrying out to support, this one candidate, then, all of a sudden you have people saying, well, I'm not going to go vote for that person, or, I'm going to stay home because the whole system's rigged anyway. So, I mean, I think that's a really interesting dilemma about how it's one thing to spot these problems and, develop the technology and the manpower and the policies to do that, but there's another whole dynamic about how you talk about them to make sure that you don't, further, or make people distrust the system even more.
Mm-hmm. Now, I would love to bring in the audience, so as you think about your questions, please raise your hand and I'll come to you. But I think that one of the questions that comes up from everything you're saying is anything that the government can do is pretty much retrospective, right? The information is out there. The fake ads or tweets or Facebook posts, whatever, will have already been created and disseminated. The people in the best position to sort of act most quickly, obviously, are the platforms. Mike, can you talk a little bit about the perspective of the platforms? And I understand from my reading that Google has pulled out of accepting any political ads in Canada ahead of the election because they thought the rules were too complicated. What is generally the position of the platforms on what they think they can do and what they don't want to be regulated into doing?
Well, it's interesting. I mean, I think you've heard Mark Zuckerberg actually come out and say he wants some regulation in this space, but I think on the other hand, you see lobbying money going against particular regulation. The Honest Ads Act, which was, I think, a Klobuchar Warren bill, is kind of sort of languished in committee. I think you see.
And what would that have done?
That would have forced transparency in any political advertising on social media. So who paid for it, where it came from, that sort of thing. Sort of similar to what you see in traditional print advertising. The platforms would have to abide by something like that too. Now they are taking steps on their own to have the repositories of advertisements and force more buyers of these ads to provide more information. But you're right. I mean, all of this is happening so quickly in real time. I mean, you can imagine a deep fake video of a candidate goes viral a day before the election, and the damage will have been done, right? So you could forget about. I mean, it'd be great to see who did that and why they did it, but that's going to happen weeks, months after an election. So I think the platforms are, on one hand, trying to stay out. They're trying to stay out in front of regulators. I'm sure they're thinking not just about what's happening in the U.S. with increased pressure on them. I think they do understand the political dynamic that Congress is unlikely to act on anything in this space during this administration. The next administration may be the same, depending on if it's Trump or not. But so I think they know that, but still they are trying to do more. They're trying to do more for their customer base, but they're also trying to do more because they see things that are happening in Europe, things that are happening in Canada, because every Western democracy is confronted with this issue. Mm-hmm. And again, I think you will see more from the platforms. One interesting other thing that Google is doing is they're trying to, within their search, prioritize original journalism. So as opposed to surfacing repurposed or repackaged or questionable news sources, trying to prioritize and identify legitimate, credible sources. I think you see similar things happening at Facebook as well.
Mm-hmm.
So.
Well, Rick, you're no longer actively in politics, but you were a senior aide at both the federal and the provincial level. How does this look to your friends who are still in politics within the parties? What is the particularly, this is a Trudeau Liberal government initiative. How are the Conservatives seeing it?
Yeah. So I think it'll be interesting to see this election, how what kind of means the political parties use to kind of reach voters. I think the last election was probably one of the first in Canada where social media was really utilized. Trudeau's folks learned a lot from the Clinton and Obama administrations on how to kind of reach voters. I think that so I think that the micro-targeting, or the amount of micro-targeting that you could do in Twitter and Facebook kind of gave an upper hand to conservatives, I think, if they did it well. I think their base and their core kind of vote is spread out in probably much more rural areas where liberals are kind of tentatively larger municipalities, larger centers, and I think that voters are probably easier to reach. So I'd be interested to see. One of the campaign managers for the Conservatives said that they were kind of ignoring Twitter, they were ignoring Facebook, they were ignoring kind of the digital ads and trying to go directly to voters to kind of build up support for a ground game around Election Day. So it'll be interesting to see. I also think one of the other issues that I think is kind of playing itself out for the first time in federal politics is the third-party advertisers and the role that they kind of play as kind of pseudo PACs. So this is Canada's kind of first foray into that. The provincial in Ontario, they've been very successful in re-electing Liberal governments, and I think over the last kind of 2 years, 3 years, there's been a resurgence in a brand called Ontario Proud, and they've now made it Canada Proud, and it's a big kind of digital operation that is focused solely on kind of bringing down liberal ideas and liberal politicians.
I should add, this is one of the interesting things about this election. Canada's moved to fixed elections, so we have a date usually well in advance. You can still have the government collapse, vote of confidence, but generally you're going to have an election in 4 years. The date's predictable in advance. One of the dilemmas that came along with that is that campaign finance restrictions and regulation of a lot of advertising really only ran from the writ period when the election is called to the day of the election, and yet parties could actually spend unrestricted monies prior to the drop of the writ. The Election Modernization Act created a sort of 6 month from June until the fixed election date in the same year, dead period where the campaign finance regulations would apply. We're testing that now. We've just had that, and it does affect the ability of parties to prepare the ground. I think one of the other things that's interesting here is the role the voters have in being willing consumers of information that may be false. So certainly you see this with people who really hate one side or the other, and they'll believe anything that comes up. The American experience with this is with Donald Trump. And so you wouldn't even have to be very clever to come up with a Donald Trump comment that sounds like, I love that Justin Trudeau, that if it goes out the night before the election, people say, oh, hey, Trump really wants Trudeau to win. Let's vote Conservative. Or, just those kind of mind-messing things that get people riled up because they're no longer trusting and participating in mainstream media as much, so they find niche media that confirms their biases, and that's a breeding ground for micro-targeting where they'll just be very quickly picking it up. And the ability of this critical election incident team to be able to sort of be in those nooks and crannies of the internet that are where influence is happening, and to be able to counter stuff is still vulnerable. I'll give you another example of one that we're wrestling with here. There's this kind of amusing, I think, but I'm amused by these things, war between a site called Snopes that does fact-checking and a site called the Babylon Bee, which is a sort of conservative satire site, where Snopes will do a story saying, this satire is all wrong. Here, we're going to fact-check this. But it's a satire. So Babylon Bee then goes back and attacks Snopes for not really being a fact-checking site, but being another satire site. And the reason that battle is so fierce is because people are worried about being deplatformed by being perceived as a disinformation source from Facebook and Twitter and other things. So there's real equities in this, in the non-political party space as well, and the dynamics of people's consumption of information, false or otherwise, are still moving pretty fast, I think.
And third parties have been searching for a long time in Canada on how to be effective during campaigns. We got rid of corporate and union donations in, I want to say 2006, 2008. So that's why the ability of big PACs to roll out massive ad campaigns just hasn't happened in Canada. which is, as third parties kind of move to the digital space, it's very, very inexpensive, very cheap to reach the amount of voters that you would normally have to spend a lot of money to get to.
And Rick, what I was trying to get at with my question, and I wonder your thoughts on this, is what do conservative parties think about this particular setup that the Liberal government has come up with? Are they concerned that it could be somehow used against their interests in the campaign, or are they glad that it's happening because this meddling could go either way and cause problems for everybody?
Yeah.
Or do they have an alternative set of policies they would have preferred to see countering disinformation?
I didn't track the kind of transition of Bill 76 that much. I've heard Liberal politicians that would probably be on the more progressive side of the party speak out in favor of this, speak out in favor of the command. I think Conservatives are probably hanging back, obviously weary of this being kind of used against them close to the election. But the one interesting thing that this command cites out specifically in the cabinet order is that it can't take direction from the Prime Minister. And the fact that was enunciated so clearly kind of shows that they were worried about the general optics of a government agency and advisors to the Prime Minister, going out and talking about election interference.
It strikes me the other thing, we'll see, but there's been a lot of speculation it's going to be a close election. So we could see a minority government or some such. So when you get that close, as we saw with the Bush v. Gore race and other races, you often have this, well, if this hadn't happened, it could have been a different result. And so the stakes are very high in a close setting, and I think it's going to be an interesting election in which to watch, unless we get a blowout, in which case people will wonder if it was a manufactured blowout.
I'm curious on election interference, on the role of multi-party systems as well. You talked about Brexit as being an example where these tactics were used. There's two sides of that debate. You're a Remainer, you're part of the Leave campaign. Same thing in the United States. You're a Democrat or you're a Republican. So unless these foreign actors or these kind of third parties have a particular horse in the game, even if they threw Conservatives under the bus and tried to bring down Andrew Scheer, what kind of role is that going to play in the resurgence of the Greens? If they tried to bring down Trudeau, where the progressive side of the political spectrum going to park their other vote? So it's probably a little more difficult to kind of predict outcomes or drive outcomes.
Any questions in our audience? Back at the mic.
Hi. Yeah, just first of all, great panel. Thank
And
you.
please introduce yourself.
Rod Elliott, and I am at Global Public Affairs, and great panel. But I guess a comment, at least for me, and I'm a little older, I'm 45, I think of elections as kind of being critical infrastructure to democracy. So, I guess that's more an editorial comment. But my question was actually was at Mike. How much do you think now, like you're covering a whole beat now on misinformation that didn't exist, 5 years ago. I do see when I talk to people, in political circles, they're much more aware of this in terms of how foreign interference could occur or how political parties could use misinformation to their advantage. But so I guess my question is, and then the platforms up in Canada have spent a lot of money cutting checks to organizations that are supportive, like Canadian Journalism Foundation, to educate the public. So how much do you think things have changed in that the public, the end consumer of the information is getting, is more educated? Or on the flip side, is it causing more challenges because people just don't believe the media anymore, the trusted media? Seems like you guys have it a lot more politicized down here than we do up in Canada. But I just was curious on your perspective.
Sure. First, so in the U.S., we do consider election infrastructure critical infrastructure. I think Jay Johnson was the one who at DHS who sort of made that call. So as such, I mean, that brings along certain protections and certain oversight. The problem, however, is unlike Canada, we have a gazillion different election administrations, commissioners who have different policies and practices and equipment and systems in place, and there's So, on like kind of the election hacking front, it's very difficult to have any kind of broad federal oversight of the systems in place, from the actual machines that you vote on to the software for voter rolls and registration. So, in just one point on that, which, I mean, it's election interference broadly, not disinformation, but we're still trying to figure out just how far the Russians really got in trying to manipulate election systems. In fact, just recently there was news that some counties in Florida were compromised. We only know which one. We only know one of them for sure, which is a fairly small county. But the FBI is not going public with the other one. So I think on that front of things, it's still a bit of a mystery. On the sort of trust in media question, I mean, I think trust in media is rapidly plummeting. I mean, it's already fairly low, I would say. And maybe some stats on that, but I think because we have a president who is outright attacking the press on a daily basis, his entire base is, no matter what we say or do, is going to be perceived as wrong or fake or misinformation or disinformation, whatever you want to call it. So, yeah, I could see a scenario where, there's a candidate that's being, and it's found out that, there's this Russian disinformation campaign on Twitter that was designed to support that candidate. Politico writes about it, and a whole half of the electorate just dismisses that news because it's deemed fake. So I mean, that's a real problem. I think it's a real problem for our entire democracy. I think it's a real problem for the media. I think it's a real problem. It's a real problem for everybody, because we are not trusting the information that we have, and we're only trusting specific segments. I think that is part of Russia's intent, in a way, is to further that distrust among people, among parties, among grassroots organizations. You do see, however, some means to remedy that. I think I mentioned how Google is trying to prioritize legitimate journalism in its search results, but Facebook is also putting a lot of money into trying to develop local news sources and help local news organizations and help them learn how to use the Facebook platform to get good reported local news stories out, because so much of what you see is garbage, right? And how do you surface the legitimate stories is a problem that we're all facing. I mean, when most of the election disinformation I encountered before 2016 were emails that my father sent me, that I had to go onto Snopes and say, no, this is garbage, do not believe this. So I think we're also responsible for spreading so much disinformation, which has always been a part of our political process, right? I think the problem becomes when it's weaponized by a foreign adversary that wants to use it not just to further a candidate, in 2016 case Donald Trump, but then sort of further divide Americans.
I would just add to that. I think, yes, I've definitely seen statistics about trust in media going down. I think it's just internally at Politico, it's something we care about a lot. We do studies of how we are perceived and compared to other media brands. We don't have editorial boards. We don't run opinion. We're very committed to being nonpartisan and neutral, and we see that in the survey results we get in terms of how would you rank this brand, left-wing, right-wing, neutral. We do get ranked neutral much more so than other news outlets. And it's something that we increasingly have to work very hard to protect, whether it's what we say on social media, how we cover the news. But we're in a moment right now, and I know this is a little off topic, but we have had to put in a lot of security at our offices. The New York Times bureau downtown here has put in enormous amounts of security. And I say that because my husband works there and I know what they've done, and it's pretty extensive. There has been a newsroom shooting not that long ago. So it's not an abstraction. It's not just a business issue. It's actually something that people have to take incredibly seriously when you're being called the enemy of the people. And some people take that very seriously. So yeah, it's an interesting moment we're living in.
And even before the kind of credibility issue surfaced around the election of Donald Trump, in Canada we've struggled in supporting our news outlets for a long time, and you've seen, I think that's kind of created a vacuum here, and I'm not sure what the American experience is, but created a vacuum in Canada where third party content creators became very powerful, and as they come out with more and more content that is digitally savvy, that is on the smartphones of millennials, on the smartphones of people like my mom, they're getting news in different ways, and I think that it's one of the solutions that I think needs to be brought to any sort of misinformation, disinformation, or election interference campaign is a strong media contingent.
And why were third parties not addressed? Do you think? Why is this?
Well, I think some of them will be called news organizations. Like there's news organizations that spawned out of the Sun news chain that push certain agendas. They're popular in kind of right-wing circles, and I think that's kind of filled a vacuum of legitimate journalism.
Mm-hmm. I wanted to ask one follow-up question on the issue of foreign interference to Mike, which is, I'm very interested in China right now and hosting a podcast at Politico called Global Translations, where we've been looking at the rise of China, the response of America, and how that's impacting the rest of the world. I'm curious, in your field, has there been any evidence to date of China attempting to do anything along the lines of what Russia did in 2016? Are they doing anything offensively, proactively to influence American politics?
So we heard a few years ago that the administration started talking about, it's not just Russia, it's China too, right? And the evidence that really came forward were a few newspaper ads, I think in Iowa, aimed at kind of the agricultural space. So it's certainly not out of the realm of possibility that others, China, Iran, also would take a page from the Russian playbook to create disinformation campaigns to support one policy, one party, one person over another. But you certainly do not see and have not seen what anything like what the GRU pulled off in 2016 and continued to do in 2016 and is expected to do in 2020 from the Chinese. I just don't think it's in the Chinese intelligence services DNA like it is in the Russian DNA, right? We've seen Russians create disinformation campaigns in the early part of the American democratic experience, right? Pulling as soon as there was a free and open press, you saw planting of bogus news stories. In fact, Thomas Rid has done a very good job of sort of charting that and talking about the history of disinformation campaigns. That said, there's a whole other avenue which the Chinese are very good at in terms of disrupting American business, American democracy, stealing information, using it for their benefit. So I would anticipate you wouldn't see sort of that propaganda campaign as much as you would see other sorts of campaign. The Chinese also use cyber attacks to intimidate activists. They track the Uyghur community. They regularly are hacking and surveilling the American Chinese rights groups and things like that. So not like what we saw in 2016 and continue to see with the Russians, but I think they'll use other means, other cyber means.
I think it's just fascinating that we had Russia interfere in a way that was aimed at helping Donald Trump, and the implications that have rolled out from that for China with this whole trade. They're probably sitting there going, why did we let Putin get away with that? It's really cost us a lot of
Time
money.
to pick a horse this year. I guess.
Right? Yeah, very interesting. Anyone else? Go ahead there, and then we'll go to the other side.
I have two questions. We can't see anyone now. A comment and then a longer question.
Great, and introduce yourself so we know.
Justin Margolis with the Quebec office.
Oh, great.
One thing different in Canada is that every year on our tax returns, we update our information with Elections Canada, whereas the U.S. it's at the DMV, which is often every 8 years you have a chance to update your tax return, and a tax return is, or your registration. A tax return is something that every citizen does every single year, which may help to the accuracy of Elections Canada, whereas the DMV, it's every 8 years, and even if you move to a new state, your old registration is not automatically pulled off, which led to the claim of there's people registering in 2 states. So that's just one comment about a difference in just getting on the electoral rolls. But this is the first year that Canadians abroad will be able to vote without the 5-year residency requirement. And I just have a question on the security of overseas voting. And I'm a dual citizen. I've never voted in person in either country's election, but yet I've never missed an election. I've always voted by mail. And it's quite different the way it's done. In the U.S., your ballot is 6 pages long. It's 3 columns. Recto verso, there's municipal, there's federal, there's judges, there's referendums, there's alcohol permit referendums. Whereas in Canada, we're going to go and we're going to get to vote, and it's going to be for one person, one thing with an X, but the overseas ballots that are sent, because Canada doesn't have to have the candidates in each riding confirmed until halfway through the period, I think it's October 3rd, the ballot we're going to get is going to have nothing on it. If it's the Canadian has to go themselves to elections.ca after October 3rd, find out who all the confirmed people in your riding are. If I want to vote Liberal, if I want to Justin Trudeau, I'd have to write the name of Stephen Guilbeault, who is the candidate for the Liberal Party in Laurier-St. Marie. If I wrote Justin Trudeau, it wouldn't be valid. If I wrote Liberal, it wouldn't be valid. So it's a lot, just because there's not enough logistically time between October 3rd and October 21st to print ballots with names on them and send it out. This is going to be the first time Canadians abroad are voting, some voting for the first time, period, because any Canadian who's ever lived in Canada now can vote in the election. It's going to be most Canadians abroad's first time voting abroad. I don't think Elections Canada has done that much education about how to vote from abroad. On the other side, for the security side, to get on the International Registry of Elections for Elections Canada, I had to submit my passport, my proof of address in Quebec, and then also my proof of address here in the U.S. I can never change my home riding. It'll always be the same. If I want to change the address where the ballot is mailed to, I have to submit new proof to Elections Canada, and it's federally administered. Whereas in Ohio, all I did was give them the last 4 digits of my social, and I had a ballot mailed to any address in the world I wanted, even the Quebec office in Brussels, Belgium. And yet if I showed up in person, I don't have the right ID to vote. So, because of the new voter ID laws, just the question is, are these ballots by mail going to cause confusion when Canadians abroad get a piece of paper with no names on it, and they're told go online, find out who your candidate is, and what's the security on the American side of being able to just give any address in the world you want, but yet showing up in person with your passport and social, you don't have the right ID to vote because it's not a state ID. So it's a rant, but it's a pertinent question.
Anyone want to take that on?
I'm happy to answer.
Oh, okay.
Not from Elections Canada, are you?
Hi, I'm Paul Cadario. Hi, Chris. At the University of Toronto, but I live here. I have voted for, as an international elector for years and years. It's not really hard to go online and find out who to vote for and write their name on the list. What is hard to make sure it arrives in Ottawa by 5 o'clock on election day, which, depending on how the mail works, is tricky. I registered, because I was on the old electoral system, the old international electoral system, which got purged with the Elections Act. I had to apply again, and 48 hours later, Elections Canada sent me an email saying, you're registered, please be sure there's an election. And then they did it again, and the next, and again, and so I'm worried, am I on there 3 times or once? Nonetheless, it's not a big deal if you want to vote. I'm not going to comment on the American system. I have a question, though, about the disinformation issue. And the comment about China actually gave me a little sub-question. There has been remarkably irresponsible reporting of the SNC-Lavalin matter, particularly by some columnists at a newspaper that broke the story. And I think it would be easy to be misled by things that have actually appeared in Canadian newspapers. What would the critical incidents protocol require be done if bots by a foreign actor were to start amplifying some of this old news, some of which has been debunked, some of which has not been properly addressed? And what sort of a problem, and Chris may have thought about this, would that create for the credibility of both the protocol, which I think is very sound, but also for the efforts by Elections Canada to make sure Canadians are offered accurate information or not overwhelmed by targeted misinformation or
So you're setting up a scenario where the scandal that's involved the prime minister,
Right.
someone wrote about it in one of the national newspapers, perhaps.
over and over again.
Okay. And now a foreign entity is amplifying
Right.
that.
But a subset of that is with China, is the system, the elections, the system that's been put in place, able to deal with Chinese disinformation that would be, say, targeted toward the suburbs of Toronto or the suburbs of Vancouver in order to influence the election? Now, I'm not sure there'd be a big change in Canadian foreign policy, whoever wins, Canadian foreign policy about China. But nonetheless, is there the capacity to deal with what might be an attack surface in terms of, okay, would we know what's going on? Would we understand that it's disinformation? Would we be able to figure out whose bots these are or where the disinformation's coming from?
I'll take the
Yep.
first part of that.
I was actually, before you jump into that, just to address I think part of the previous question was about the security of voting by mail, right? Which I think in this country at least is perceived to be one of the more secure ways to vote. Because, you're not using a computer, you're not, the postal service is hard to hack, right? Once the mail's in there, it gets arrived.
Eventually.
Eventually. The other problem, like the logistics are another problem, but the actual security of being compromised is fairly safe. In the U.S., there's been some experimentation with voting, expat voters using mobile apps to vote, which has been widely condemned by the security community as being ripe for, tampering with. So I just wanted to make that point.
One of the things that I believe is in the bill as well is any person that sponsors tweets or sponsors or has ad campaigns, they actually have to have a Canadian bank account. So that would kind of fall under FinTrack, which is kind of their financial investigative body of the federal government. So they would know what bank account it came from, where the money was wired. It's not as if you can set up a Venmo or a PayPal account.
So I feel like I'm going to make matters worse because you know that old joke about the babysitter who there's a scary person. I'm getting all these calls, and they call, and the police say, yes, they're coming from within the house, and you realize, because I think foreign influence in Canadian elections might be most likely to come from the United States. And I don't mean that it would be a Trumpian campaign, but one of the things that has happened already in this campaign, even though no political party, as far as I know, has a platform in Canada about eliminating abortion or abortion access, there are many groups here who are quite hot on that subject. Now, what happens if a Canadian reads an American ad saying abortion is bad, and Trudeau's talked about the Conservatives taking it away, and you get that kind of influence? The Harper government was quite worried about environmental groups that were sending money north of the border to try to stir up opposition to oil pipelines. So not an organized government effort, but what if American debates crossed the permeable border? And the actual information may be information or disinformation, but it occurs outside Canada. It's not part of a campaign. How do we deal with that? For example, let's say there's a story, and you were talking about SNC-Lavalin, but let's say there was a story that Wall Street is concerned there's going to be a recession next week. And you think, oh, do I want to elect the Trudeau people because they're going with higher taxes and bigger deficits? Maybe we'd be safer with the Conservatives. So it can even be those kinds of things. So that would be my first concern, is I'm a little worried about that. Secondly, we've seen in the United States polling that everybody has the imagine, Nielsen or Gallup is calling everybody on the phone, and we used to talk about, well, are they going to get people on their cell phones? But a lot of political forecasting is based on social media data mining, looking at what you look at, where, trying to estimate where support is and so on, and guide political parties on that indirect basis. So if you have false information in there, it may not be about influencing voters, it may be influencing perceptions of voters. And all you need is an election that is wildly out of line with what the polls all said was going to happen, which was sort of the Trump problem, and you automatically create suspicion and delegitimacy in some people's minds for the outcome of the election. So putting all of those things together, I think there's a lot of vulnerability we haven't quite tacked onto. And there's one more that I'm going to add, which is not going to make anybody happy, and that's we sometimes pretend the internet is all in English. And yet, in various communities, they're participating in an internet which is not in English. And so what I worry about for the people who have to do the critical election incident public protocol is, what if, to use the example that Paul raised, what if the attempt is to influence Cantonese speakers in Vancouver and Toronto? They're absorbing this in Cantonese, not even Mandarin. It may have originated in China, and will these guys even know anywhere near in a timely fashion to alert people? And if they did, would those voters necessarily be responsive because they may not be paying attention? So this is not a criticism of what Canada's trying to do, only to suggest that it's a start, but we're going to have a lot more work to do. And I think focusing on Russia and China in Canada's case is probably missing the elephant south of the border, which is us.
Whoops. Any other questions? Just someone who hasn't spoke over here.
Hi, I'm Jim Dickmeyer. I'm with the Canada Institute at the Woodrow Wilson Center right now. I'd like to step back and see what we're talking about in a kind of historical perspective and where we're at in its cycle. We had radio as a new technology that came in, and people could use that. We saw that certainly in pre-World War II, where the Axis was trying to keep the U.S. out of the war, and the Allies, British, were using radio and so on to bring us in. TV certainly had its impact on how the American public saw Vietnam War and so on. Where are we in this technology and that kind of cycle? Because we've survived kind of those effects of technology on democratic norms in their time. Are we going to kind of survive this, or is it distinctly different?
What do you think, Mike?
Well, I would say we're in the infancy, right? We're just trying to figure out how to live with technology, and that spans all parts of society, right? It spans how I deal with my 14-year-old's Instagram account to how we deal with information coming at us at, faster than we can even think about all sorts of opinions and where it's coming from, and figuring out how we trust that. And, and to transactional relationships online and building in trust while maintaining privacy. So, we're still trying to figure out how to walk with technology. And I think I'm an optimist, so I think we'll survive. I think there are tremendous good things that the technology that we all use today can be deployed to make things better and safer and make our democracies stronger. But I do also think it's going to get worse before it gets better, right? Because what we're seeing here is everyone trying to play catch up, and Washington is 5 to 10 years behind what's happening in Silicon Valley and figuring out the implications for technology. We're on the verge of another sort of technological revolution with artificial intelligence, and what that's going to do for information and our democracy and our workforce is it's already beginning to happen. We haven't even really talked about that in a substantial way in Washington yet. So
We have an AI summit tomorrow
this
at
is
Politico.
a plug to
All day.
segue that, so if you want to figure that out. So I think we'll survive, and we're just figuring out the blips, and we'll make it work. I think that, with print, we're still dealing with the disinformation in print and still trying to get our media right. But hopefully we'll figure out these tough questions as well. I don't know, what do you guys think?
Yeah, I mean, like you think about the short period of time that these digital platforms and social platforms have been offered. They've done some pretty incredible things, and I think you still have massive communications walls erected in places like China. Like think about the possibilities of these networks in countries like that. So I think we focus on kind of the defensive side. On the negative things that these tools can be used for, but they can be an agent of good. And I think at the end of the day, we've been focused for the last 3 years, since the last presidential election, on kind of what happened, and we kind of approach these stakeholders in a very defensive way. They need to be part of the solution at the end of the day. And I think that the technology that they have, the experience they have, is can be a mark for good, but it needs to engage with government in order to find those solutions.
Interesting. I had an interesting conversation with Michael Adams. Some of you will know the Canadian pollster, wrote a couple books, Sex in the Snow, about Canadians, and Fire and Ice about Canada's comparison.
Very Canadian.
And we had a chance to meet.
Sounds like an HBO show.
It does, yeah. But he said, we had just talked briefly, and he said, so I want to understand kind of where you're coming from this. An American is interested in Canada. And I said, well, I don't know, Michael. I could tell you that I'm a middle-aged white guy who goes to church on Sunday and lives in the suburbs and drives a sedan. And because he's a pollster, he's like, okay, I have your profile. And I worry a little bit that AI, artificial intelligence, will have a similarly deterministic, reductionist effect, that what in the early days won't be very sophisticated, but will actually just try to reduce voters down to these 3 things are the most likely to shift voter behavior, but miss some of the complexity we know is out there from our political science research in voter decision formation. So I am a little worried about AI, not in the conventional way of Skynet, but just because I wonder if this powerful tool, in order to be effective, will have to be a bit of a blunt instrument. Maybe over time it gets better. The other thing, kind of picking up on something some of the other folks have said, I worry about timing. Everything's so much faster in this world of the internet. And we used to talk about the October surprise, the big piece of news that could shift an American election in November that comes out in October, and there's just not enough time to change people's minds. I think in Canada, you could have an October 20th surprise, and except for the mail-in voters, where there's really not enough time to correct the record. It's all going to happen sort of virally in real time. And it's one thing if you have something that's clearly political speech that's triggering that, maybe an ad. But what if it's an Instagram photo of somebody who was killed with a handgun, or that's the claim, and it's just the photo, and there's really not a lot of verbal content, and it starts going, and people are like, yeah, we need more gun control laws, and that becomes the issue. So I think that there's a lot of gray, and Paul's right. With bot amplification, you can take that gray, you can very much put it in people's minds and create the kind of doubts that's going to make elections much more complicated for people, I suspect.
I mean, these things have happened in the past, even before kind of the digital wave. I remember the 2011 election, sitting in a bar in downtown Ottawa, and finding out that Osama bin Laden had been captured and killed. And the first thing that I thought was, hey, this is great, this is justice. But 2 was, how is this going to affect the election? There's clearly one kind of hawkish foreign policy mind at the table, and that was Stephen Harper, and there was one dove in the NDP. So I think these October surprises, or these kind of last minute stories, will transcend even whatever comes next after social media.
Mm-hmm. Well, I think we're getting down on our time. I want to just talk through what I think our takeaways would be today. Clearly, this new policy that Canada has brought in is, as far as these things go, more robust than what other countries have done. It is possible, I think, in part because of a national elections administration and because of a centralized form of government that is able to do sort of a whole of government approach to these things. I think on the flip side, we've heard a lot this morning that would suggest that it can only go so far. This makes this election very interesting to see, as you put it, how it will be road tested, whether it falls into some kind of politicization trap or not. The role of nonpartisan public servants will be very interesting to watch, to see if they actually do pull the alarm on anything, and if so, how that plays out. I think it'll be interesting to watch in the coming year whether the U.S. takes any steps, and the kinds of pressures that are being put to bear on the platforms. So thank you all for helping illuminate this interesting issue at a timely moment. I will put in a plug that today we are launching our Canada election coverage on Politico.com, so please check it out. We're doing a big polling page and a lot of coverage for the next few weeks. And Chris and I will be co-hosting with Scotty Greenwood a Canadian Election Night Watch Party
You're all welcome.
here in DC. You're all welcome. So stick with us. We're going to be watching this election really closely. And thank you all.
Can I put in one last word just from my side? I think that one of the challenges of every kind of policy now is that we're all quite ideological, or we have our biases and so on. And there's something to be said for the way Canada does things, trying as best it can to manage an evidence-based policy, formulation process. And for the United States, as contentious as anything to do with election administration reform is going to be, Canada may not have solved all the problems, but I think Canada is going to give us some useful data in an environment which might not be quite as hot as our own experience. And I think the value of you all coming, and really appreciate everybody who's been here, is that what we can learn from Canada might help us. This isn't the answer, but it might help us get to the answer a few iterations down the road. So good on Canada.
Well, we're all in it together, right? All right. Thank you all.